Welcome back everybody to section 4. Here we're going to talk about plate boundaries. What's happening here? So the first thing we'll talk about is a convergent boundary, converging, two things coming together. Best way to remember this is convergent plates collide. We've got two plates moving towards each other. Usually a convergent boundary is a place where you have subduction or a subduction zone, where one plate actually ends up sliding beneath another plate. This is a place where you typically get powerful, deep earthquakes, lots of volcanoes, and we'll talk a little bit about the three types of convergent boundaries. We have ocean-continent convergent boundaries, we have ocean-ocean convergent boundaries, and continent-continent convergent boundaries, which are sometimes referred to as collision zones. So what's going on in this diagram? On the left we have an oceanic plate, and on the right we have a continental plate. And where the two meet, you can see that the oceanic plate is actually being forced downward, sinking down into the mantle. And this is called subduction. And at the place where the oceanic plate and the continental plate meet, the oceanic plate actually pulls the edge of the continent down a little bit with it and makes what is called a trench. If you've ever heard of something like the Marianas Trench, that is what's going on here. And now there's something else on this diagram that is important too, and that is the volcanism. So as this plate descends, it starts to heat up as it gets to the warmer part of the Earth, and it starts to shed water as it goes down there. And as a result of it shedding water and getting warmer, it actually starts to melt a little bit. And this melted material comes up through the continental plate here, and then bursts out as a volcano on the continent. And one example of this is here in North America. So we have an oceanic plate, something called the Juan de Fuca plate, which is actually subducting beneath the North American plate, continental plate. And as a result, what we get is this line of volcanoes, the Cascade volcanoes, which mirror the plate boundary, but are actually on the continent. Now, sometimes you have subduction, you have a convergent boundary, two plates colliding, but there's no continent involved at all. Instead, you have an oceanic plate, which is sinking beneath another oceanic plate. But there is something in common with the last example we looked at, which is the volcanoes. So we have our downgoing plate, it starts to get wet, it gets warmer, and it starts to melt. The melt material rises up through the overlying plate on top, and produces these volcanic island arcs. Very interesting. And one example of this is the Aleutian Island arc up in Alaska. So you can actually see this sort of curved arc shape here. All of this is volcanic, part of the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, which we'll talk about later. Now, our final example is where you have a continent which is colliding with another continent, a collision. Now, it's very, very complicated and not completely settled how much subduction there is. Now, there is subduction in the diagram here, but it's a complicated question and it's not entirely known what the answer is. But one thing that is known is this, development of mountain ranges. So the way that I always like to remember this, you imagine you're putting your hands together like this. Neither one of them wants to sink down, so what do you get? You get this rise in the middle that is the mountain range. And the classic example of a collision, a continent-continent convergent boundary, is the Himalayas. So you have the Indian subcontinent, which is coming up and crashing into Asia. But because it's continental crust, it's so light and buoyant that it doesn't want to sink down. So instead, we have this giant car crash pileup that makes these mountains. Now, our next type of plate boundary is a divergent boundary. So convergent plates collide, divergent plates divide. We have two plates that are moving apart from each other, like you can see in the diagram here. And here in the middle, this is sometimes called a rift, sometimes called a mid-ocean ridge, sometimes called a spreading center. This is the point where warm material is rising up through the crust, where we have new ocean crust created. And an important point on these, so there is some earthquake activity here, and this is also a place where you have a lot of magmatic activity, but you wouldn't exactly say that there are a lot of volcanoes here along the divergent boundary. And one good example of a divergent boundary is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, talking about this running down all the way across the Atlantic Ocean here. Now, an important point, you know that continent plates can actually have land and ocean on them. So what we're looking at here is actually a divergent plate boundary between North America and Africa, or down here between South America and Africa. In other words, this right here is the plate boundary between the South American plate and the African plate. So our final boundary is the transform boundary. So converging plates collide, diverging plates divide, and transform boundaries is a place where plates slide. So these are two plates which are moving horizontally past each other. You do get strong earthquakes with these, but no sort of volcanic activity. One good example of a transform boundary is here at the San Andreas Fault. So if we move a little bit south of where we were before, we have two plates which are moving past each other horizontally. One plate is moving here, one plate is moving here, but we're not pulling apart and we're not colliding together. Putting it all together now, this map where we have convergent plate boundaries in blue with a teeth, divergent plate boundaries with a teal, and transform boundaries here with purple, actually does a very good job of explaining why these are the locations on Earth where we see volcanoes and why these are the locations on Earth where we have earthquakes. Especially notice the deep earthquakes are associated with the teeth, the convergent plate boundaries. Stay tuned for the next section. We cover plate tectonics in Arizona.